This model where we have the best response curve and the isoprofit curve is sometimes called the labor discipline model, which I don't really like that term that much, but the idea is that uh, the worker has something to lose by becoming unemployed, right? Which makes sense. If she didn't have anything to lose, then she wouldn't have the job. So there's this equilibrium. It's a Nash equilibrium. If you're not familiar with that term, don't worry about it too much. Um, you can look it up in chapter 4 if you want to, but it's not going to be too important in this class. There's some rent that really both Maria and the employer are getting, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be willing to make that employer-employment match. And there's some level of power because the employer is able to fire the worker if she doesn't do a good job, right? So the idea is that there's going to be some involuntary unemployment for people who lose their jobs. They would rather have the job than not have the job. And so that involuntary unemployment is because workers are paid above their reservation wage. They're getting some rent. Now, how do we know there's involuntary unemployment? Well, imagine that you have a job paying $50,000 a year. And if you ever lost that job, if you ever showed up and your boss said, hey, you're laid off, then you're able to find an exactly the same job at $50,000 a year doing the exact same thing. Well, then you wouldn't worry about losing your job, right? And so in that case, the employment rents are zero because your reservation wage is exactly the same as your current wage. And if that's the case, then you don't have to ever worry about working hard. You would only work if it was something where the disutility of work was actually negative, right? So you got some positive benefit from working. And in that case, if nobody does any work, there's no incentive to pay anybody, nobody has a job, etc. Now, what it doesn't mean is that you couldn't have something like a government jobs program, right? It would just have to be that government jobs program paid at some level that was below most people's wages, right? So maybe if the minimum wage is $9 an hour, a government jobs program would pay $6 an hour, right? It would be the same basically as unemployment benefits, but with a job, with work requirements, right? So you'd still have it. Wouldn't exactly be unemployment, but it would still be, hey, I'm doing this because I can't find anything else, which is involuntary. So the key is that as unemployment goes up, it's harder to find a job, okay? So that means that the rent from having a job increases as the unemployment rate goes up, which means that the best response curve shifts to the left when there's a higher unemployment rate. And so if at $18 an hour before you were willing to give 0.75 effort, now if the unemployment rate goes up, that means your employment rent goes up. Now you're willing to give 0.85 effort because you really don't want to lose your job, right? So you're going to work harder. You're willing to work harder. Whereas if, say, your unemployment benefit goes up, so that if you do lose your job, instead of $6 an hour, maybe you get $10 an hour. Now your employment rent has gone down, and so now you're not willing to work as hard. Right now, maybe you're only willing to give 0.6 effort instead of the 0.75 or 0.85. And so that best response curve is going to be shifting around depending on the unemployment rate in the economy, the unemployment benefits in the economy, all of your outside options, which are going to change based on how the economy is doing and what the institutions are in place that will protect you if you lose your job. So what this means is that we can think about a wage curve. And now a wage curve is going to relate the employment rate or unemployment rate, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, to the wage, okay? And what it's going to depend on is that shifting best response function. And there is some evidence that this does hold in reality, but keep in mind that we're thinking about a wage for sort of everybody when we know that people get different wages based on their education, their skills, their experience, and then things like discrimination based on gender and race. And so we have to still take it with a grain of salt, but there is some evidence that this holds in the macroeconomy. So what this means is that we're going to put the employment rate on the horizontal axis. And so the employment rate is basically just 1 minus the unemployment rate. An unemployment rate is just how many people who would like to be working are not working. And we'll talk about that more in later chapters, right? We're going to come back to it, but it's a reason that we want to talk about this sort of micro chapter in our macro class. So as the unemployment rate goes up or the employment rate goes down, so we're moving to the left in this curve, the real wage is going to go down, right? So if the unemployment rate is 5%, like it is in the United States right now, the wage will be higher. And if it's 12%, like it was, well, didn't quite get to 12% in the Great Recession, but it got to about 10%, the wage will be lower. So why is that going on? Well, it's all about a shift in the best response function. In this case, moving from an unemployment rate of 5%, where you'll be able to find a new job pretty quickly, to an unemployment rate of 12%, where it's going to take a lot longer to find a new job, shifts the best response function to the left, and we move from point B to point A. In that case, firms can be on a higher iso-profit curve and pay a lower wage but get the same amount of effort, or a similar amount of effort anyway. And so in this case, we're tracing out the wage curve, moving from A at an unemployment rate of 12 to B at an unemployment rate of 5. If the unemployment rate was really high, we'd have a much lower wage, and if it was really low, we could have a much higher wage. So this means that policies can actually be pretty important, right? If we raise unemployment benefits, that's going to increase the reservation wage. That's going to shift our wage curve up. That's going to shift the best response function and lower firms' profits. So if you're a firm that is only interested in your profits, you say, well, I don't think we should have such good unemployment benefits. I don't think we should have things like medical insurance for people who are unemployed, because that's going to make it easier to be unemployed, and I want it harder to be unemployed so that that best response function shifts up and I can be on a higher iso-profit curve. So this, the book talks about the shape of the wage curve makes zero unemployment undesirable. For the firms, sure, zero unemployment is undesirable. Zero unemployment is also impossible, right? Because we always have people that are quitting jobs, moving places, graduating from school without a job, always looking for a job. And one thing about the labor market is it takes a lot of time to find new jobs. But we do want to think about what our unemployment benefits should be, right? We could have an unemployment rate of 12% with high unemployment benefits and low unemployment benefits that shift the wage curve up or down, right? And so this was one of the criticisms of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act during the Great Recession, was that we extended unemployment benefits from 26 weeks up to a high of 99 weeks, and that shifted up our wage curve. That's a hard argument to make, however, given the data, because the data show really low wage growth during the Great Recession, and even after the Great Recession, wage growth has not been very good. However, there is some evidence over a long period of time that we do see this wage curve emerge. And so this takes data from 1979 to 2013 and looks at what the wage curve looks like. We have annual earnings on the vertical axis adjusted for inflation, and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, where it would be 0 over here on the right and 20 over here on the left, so it's inverted. And it does control for things like education, for experience, for gender, for race. These are just the point estimates of prime age working white men. So there is some evidence for this wage curve. I just think we should always, with all models, take it with a bit of a grain of salt.